Hello. In episode 8.3 of AS for Architecture, I spoke with an academic trio, perhaps a musical one, definitely a political and spatial one, Helen Runting, Tahl Kaminer and Leonard Ma, about their recent book, Urbanizing Suburbia, Gentrification, the Financialization of Housing, and the Remaking of the Outer European City, published by Jovis in July this year.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to three phenomenal scholars, Helen Runting, Tahl Kaminer and Leonard Ma, about their recent book, Urbanizing Suburbia, published by Jovis. We'll come to the full title in a second, but before we do that, thank you for joining me. And Helen, would you introduce yourself to begin with?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak to you today. My name's Helen Runting. I'm an urban planner and urban designer. My PhD's in architectural theory, and I run an architecture practice called Secretary with two others. We're very small, based in the southern suburbs here in Stockholm, Sweden.
Are you from Stockholm, Sweden?
No, I'm Australian.
So what brought you to Stockholm, Sweden, and to the suburbs specifically?
Yeah, I've been living here for about 16 years. I originally moved because this is one of the few bastions of free education in a European context for us non-EU citizens. So I moved to Sweden in 2007 in order to do a master's in urban design, and I stuck around. Something about this place.
An educational migrant. I like this. This is quite a niche form of migrancy in the 21st century. I like it. Leonard, what about you? Where are you? Who are you?
Hi, my name is Leonard Ma. I'm a Canadian architect, and I live and work in Helsinki, where I have a practice called public office. I'm also a teacher at the Estonian Academy of Arts.
Which is, as you said before we recorded, 2 hours by boat away from where you live.
On a good day.
On a good day. I think this is great. That's a commute. I mean, my commute's pretty mild compared with that. And what did your practice do? What do you do I mean, maybe this is a question for Helen as well. So what does secretary do? What does public office do?
Helen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in the middle of a growing recession, Amber, because the answer is everything and anything we can get our hands on. It's an interesting moment here in Sweden. The construction industry is basically in free fall. So as a smaller office, working in a highly centralized architectural industry where a lot of work is concentrated to a number of very, very large firms. The smaller, more independent offices tend to get their fingers stuck into every pie possible. But we do a lot of work within public art, research, housing and planning advice. So we're sort of working across multiple scales, I would say. The other two directors are architects, and I work more at the urban scale, but usually we work in collaborations with others, particularly when we're doing research. That's really part of the setup here in Scandinavia, these large conglomerations of business and university and research centers. So we're trying to kind of pick our way through that. And we're really interested in, I guess, the politics of infrastructure and what architecture can do in a late welfare state.
Look at that. If we didn't want to now speak to Leonard and Tahl, that would be the perfect segue, because I think that's really, really kind of indicates why you wrote this book, really, or why you're editing this book anyway. Leonard, what does your practice do?
Yeah, so ostensibly we say we operate at the intersection of political economy and design. Mm-hmm. And this manifests itself in multiple ways. Again, like Helen said, we're also a very small practice. Usually it's just myself and a couple of different collaborators, but also we work within kind of, let's say, bigger collaborations, and we work on things like housing design. We work with nonprofits to develop models of affordable housing, and the main project we've been working on recently has been a project for a small town in Austria, that we won through competition, and it's been, let's say, a kind of catalyst for a lot of the ideas in this book as well, where these kind of inner city urban ideas get pushed further and further away from the metropolitan center. Yeah. So I think like, yeah, we operated a bunch of scales, like both in terms of like planning, but also in housing design. And we tried to let's say take a pragmatic but critical view towards kind of mundane things like budgets and making like dividing building plots, in that we see great agency in that kind of level of planning, let's say.
Excellent, thank you. Tahl, last but
Hi,
by no means least.
hi, Ambrose. My name is Tahl Kaminer, and I'm at Cardiff University at the Welsh School of Architecture. Before that, I was at the University of Edinburgh, and before that at TU Delft. So a little bit of continental input in addition to all of the rest. So I don't have a practice. I'm not busy with any practice-related things. More of a full-time academic for good and bad.
A theorist.
Could be.
Yeah, I think you're a theorist. I think that's where you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think theorist has a bit of a bad reputation, but again, that might be another podcast. So I will kind of.
I didn't know. I thought that was more respectable than scholar, and certainly more respectable than academic.
Well, I'm not sure anymore, but again, that might be another podcast, the question of theory.
But this is the second time I've spoken to you on the podcast. The previous time, obviously, was with The Efficacy of Architecture, which is an elegant read. But I remember in that podcast that we recorded, you talked about how your principal interest wasn't specifically architecture as a design practice, but as a component part of a broader political kind of context. And this book, Urbanizing Suburbia, Hyper-gentrification, the financialization of housing, and the remaking of the outer European city, is certainly much more to do with that.
Yes, I mean, again, I don't think our perspective was architectural. It's more urban coming to this book, right? So while we do think architects will show interest in it, it's also directed to urban designers, planners, maybe even city councillors who have interest in some of the bigger picture questions. Mm-hmm. So this is not a narrow architectural book, really, in any sense. It's not really about the role of the architect, but more about a current process which is taking place in certain cities, not everywhere. And this process affects everyone in these cities, right? Including what architects do in practice, of course.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could start by I don't know, Helen or Leonard. Maybe we could hear about like what the objectives of the book and its motivations. Like, where did it come from? As I put in my notes to you last night, why this book now? Like, what's the condition in front of us that makes this book the right book for the moment? Time, mainly.
You want to go?
Yeah. Helen, I'm going to put it on you. Oh no, Leonard, your mic's off. You can go.
Oh, okay. Well, I think at least my personal motivation and the initial interest was really kind of working in practice, that it really felt like the kind of dominant planning imaginary was really about this kind of high density, mixed use, livable urbanity. And you had renderings full of pedestrian streets, full of cafes and bicycle lanes and so on. And I think that, I know that there's maybe others would share this sense of unease with how, let's say, easily and how smoothly this has been adopted within the profession. And I think, like, let's say the motivation with this book was in the introduction, we make this reference to Neil Smith, where we try to identify that these are not really consumer choices necessarily, but also results of certain structural conditions of capitalism. And a lot of the impetus for us and why this particular moment was that, especially in Europe, and the book is very much focused on Europe, is that since this financial crisis, the engine of capital growth has really been real estate. And this has profound implications at the scale of the city. I'm happy to pass it to Helen if she wants to add something.
Yeah, perhaps Helen, you could talk, maybe, I guess, introduce the book. Like, what is the thesis? What is it? Where is it aiming towards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this book is trying to tell the same story or versions of the same story through the lens of four different cities.
Mhm.
So we look to case studies in London, in Berlin, in Amsterdam, and in Stockholm, considering how what we call the outer city is being redeveloped, densified, and urbanized through new build housing projects. We're really interested in, as Leonard highlighted, the structural kind of mechanisms that are being invoked in order to achieve that development, but also, I guess, the planning ideals that are driving the form of them, even if we're not particularly talking about architectural aesthetics. But for instance, in the Stockholm chapter, we talk a lot about housing arrangements, the way in which we access these forms of housing, the way in which we own them, the way in which we don't get access to them and will never own them. And I think in kind of bouncing between these different, quite situated cases, we're able to perhaps describe a phenomenon that doesn't conform to previous descriptions, that requires a new vocabulary.
Yeah, there's something I was reading through again this morning, and I wanted to pick up on, which was your discussion around the idea of waves, which I thought was really, really well. It's not yours, is it? It's whose chapter is it in? It's Jennifer Max. This idea of waves, that gentrification, rather than being a process, is a series of waves, each which have a separate characteristic, and we're in a particular area. Tahl.
Maybe a step back regarding motivation. Around 6 years ago, I ran a studio in Thamesmead, right, southeast London, in the outer city. And as somebody who doesn't live in London but visits it quite often, you kind of see the changes taking place with these kind of start-stop moments. And of course, you know, when you travel to Thamesmead, and if you haven't been there for a long time, suddenly you see all of the building in Woolwich, in Barking, all along the River Lee and the Thames, and it's kind of the level, the scale is crazy, if you like, right? It's really shocking, no other word for the scale of what's going on there. And of course, the story told is always about the East, right? Whether it's called City in the East or Thames Mouth development or whatever. However, when you start looking at things like the London plan, you see something else is going on, and it's bigger than the East. It's really about densifying the outer boroughs, right? The outer boroughs of London. And when you start looking at other cities, well, you know, I don't see it in Cardiff where I work or Bristol where I live. Doesn't happen everywhere, but in those specific cities where you have particularly high pressure on the inner city regarding real estate, that's where you start seeing these kind of things happening. So I think that's one of the motivations. Also, you know, just an anecdote I saw, I think, who was it? Robert Maxwell, one of the partners of Allies and Morrison, show projects they were doing in the outer city of London, and they were all high density. And after his talk, you know, we chatted a bit, and, you know, he was very aware of what the projects are for the neighborhood and how they're densifying and changing the neighborhood. But he wasn't aware of a bigger process, right? The issue of people already involved in these things having some understanding of what's going on, but they don't see the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. So in a way, the book comes to correct that and offer the explanation, not just what is happening, but why it's happening, and so on. So that's, let's say, the background motivation from my perspective. I would also maybe add that, you know, if you notice, we're not just in different cities, the three of us, but our angles are slightly different, right? I think we also see the readership slightly differently, right? So Leonard wants to emphasize, for example, the fact that it's not cultural choices which are taking the lead. For me, the readers, I imagine, know that already, right? So we are taking slightly different angles, let's say, looking at this, and different ways of approaching it. So when it comes, yeah, sorry.
No, after you.
Well, the issue of waves, you know, that comes from a very famous article from 20 years ago by Neil Smith and co, and it really moves us away from what's called the phases idea, right? We talk a lot about the phases especially in the media, right? That you have maybe the artist comes in to a neighborhood, and later you have the kind of lower middle class, upper middle class professionals, and you know, this kind of phases in which gentrification happens. Waves is really about how gentrification, in what it is, changes, right? How gentrification around 1964, when it was discovered, let's say, was different from gentrification in the, let's say, late 1970s, or gentrification today, right? These are waves because they have a different character, different agents involved, and different ways in which they happen, right? So the theory of waves is that we have very different waves, and gentrification as a process is very different in these different eras and contexts. That makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, thinking about that, this idea of a trajectory or a process of gentrification kind of correlates to like an evolutionary idea, like it's an ambivalent process, an organic process, whereas this idea of waves does kind of bring in the possibility of external agencies. And so I wanted to come back to this like, sort of defining the terms. I mean, we've got urban and we've got suburban, and I think perhaps people have an image in their head. I certainly have an image in my head of what that means. Urban looks like sorry, my computer is about to do something evil and I've got to stop it. No, seriously, it's the worst. Like, it's basically run by the university and they can just do whatever they like, whenever they like. I'll cut this bit out, by the way. Yeah, so I wanted to come back to this idea between the difference between urban and suburban. Obviously, we have this mental image, particularly in Britain, and particularly embedded in American ideas of suburbia because of their media and the way that they've promoted this idea, but also of the city as this kind of gritty urban thing. What do we mean, and how does therefore how does the suburb become urbanized? Who's going to talk about that? You have to lean in, guys.
Yeah, I think we were very lucky to have Jennifer Mack, who's an architect and anthropologist based in Stockholm, to write a chapter in the introduction where she also tries to really go into the definition of suburb by comparing the suburb of her American background with the suburb of her Swedish kind of current location, because I think it's important to add that in a European context, suburb also, and particularly in a Nordic context, suburb also includes these high density prefabricated concrete multi-unit housing areas that were built in the post-war era, which don't at all look like the kind of sugar cube bungalow low density sprawl that we might consider when we think about American suburbia. So we also need to be careful that our vision of suburbia is not confined to a kind of middle class, two cars, nuclear family, backyard. Say this is an Australian, the quarter acre block kind of imaginary, because here at least in Sweden, when we talk about the suburbs, we're also talking about a geography that's highly segregated in terms of socioeconomic status, even ethnicity, that's highly debated and demonized in the media. That's at the center of a series of political, fights right now, and that it has even made it to the kind of level of the forced resignation of our prime minister, our previous prime minister. So it's like really important that we don't just think of a traditional suburbia when we talk about these things. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So suburbia, as you pointed out in the introduction to the book, was historically a contextual thing, a situated thing, something that has local characteristics. And yeah, there's this dominant idea of either the Victorian suburb or Levittown or whatever. But but we're not talking about that here. Or are we talking about the imposition of a singularity of suburbia on Tahl?
Thanks. I think, look, we spent, I think, what was it, 2 years discussing terms, right? Definitions and how to articulate the process. So 2 years, of course, not daily, but I think we had monthly almost meetings in which we went around, sometimes in a circular way, trying to work with material coming from suburban studies and elsewhere to try and define things in the way that suits the book, that suits what we're trying to describe. And one thing that helped a lot is using the term the outer city as opposed to suburbia. So the outer city we started using, and again, more, let's say, rigorously in the book, to describe geographically the areas which are more distant from the city center, right? And we use the term suburbia to describe, again, the definitions we use are there to capture both the kind of high-rise post-war areas and the low-rise middle class or lower middle class areas. So suburbia as a kind of low density, because of course a high-rise also comes with low density, right? Because they normally have a lot of green around them and so on. So overall low or low to medium densities, and also certain characteristics regarding tenure and other things. So suburbia is what we have in our own imaginary, right? So it's not the American suburbia, but what counts for our four cities as suburbia, which again is diverse enough, right? I mean, in London you get everything in suburbia. In Amsterdam, less so, but even there it's diverse enough. So really that's the basis. The question of how do we use these terms, because they're not only contested, they are very messy, right? And we didn't want to just work with where suburban studies are right now. And we mentioned, I think, in the book, the term post-suburbia, which is very useful for suburban studies to capture internationally, globally, the different conditions you find across the world regarding these kind of areas in the outer city. But it doesn't help us very much, because post-suburbia just captures a condition, and we want to talk about the process, right? A process in which the outer city changes its character from what we call suburban to something that is urban.
So what is this change, and how does it happen? How does this urbanization of suburbia happen? Perhaps Leonard, you could chip in.
Yeah. And I think part of also the choice of these terms is kind of certain kind of homage to Neil Smith, in the sense of like a kind of back to the city movement from the suburbs. We're now looking at a kind of addendum to this, where inner city prices are so high that again you have this kind of movement, but back out of the city. And what we want to argue is that this is not, let's say, supplanting this previous process, right? Because even though there's this kind of densification and urbanization of suburbia, you don't see a corresponding drop in these inner city prices. You see a kind of uniform rise. And for us, this is quite distinct in terms of, let's say, patterns of how we normally think of urban expansion. So we have a kind of reference to this megalopolis model by Gene Gottman, which would normally see the suburb as a kind of counterpart to the urban, but as it expands, it densifies and so on. But what happens is a kind of continual expansion of this periphery. In the cities that we're looking at, we don't really see this kind of continued suburban expansion. Rather, we see a kind of definitive kind of edge or kind of break at the kind of limit of the city. And at least I think, let's say, what this might tell us, or what this process might reveal, is really a kind of, let's say, further emphasis of how urbanization is now the main avenue of capital accumulation, if we kind of borrow Henri Lefebvre's argument, where capital accumulation isn't occurring, in factories or from, let's say, farming or anything like this, but really from urbanization and real estate growth. And what we've seen since this financial crisis is precisely this, let's say, this kind of low interest rate environment with an abundance of capital that has really driven this process of growth. And it has now kind of moved further and further out of the inner city and into the suburbs or the outer city, as we talked about now.
So from a sort of layperson's perspective, do you see 2008 represents the kind of the bursting of that real estate bubble to some degree?
Yeah, and
yet none of the processes that formed it actually stopped. Nothing changed. But so what has happened in the subsequent years to generate what you're referring to here as a fourth wave gentrification, and what is the impact? Yeah. So like how are we still here? Tahl, you had your hand up.
Oh, I was just signaling fifth wave.
Oh, fifth wave.
Yes. It's already fifth wave.
There we go. So they're almost like ripples now. They're coming.
Yes. Well, again, as usual, these things don't happen in one go. But I think what happened because of the crisis was that certain things became more evident, right? I mean, if you're based in England, you could see what's happening in London. The fact that investments were pulled out of precarious places, whether it's Athens or before that the Costa Brava or something like that, and they went to safety. And some of the safety places are cities like London and Berlin, right? And that huge move of transnational wealth, Manuel Albers called it, was very visible. I mean, in UK, of course, around 2014, 2015, the housing crisis was top on the political agenda, right? Because of what was happening in places, particularly like London, where there was already no correlation between housing prices and earnings, even of the well-off Brits. So that process in which transnational investment went into housing was not in itself new. It simply grew, I think, in scale, and Leonard can add to that also. I think one of the things that Manuel Albers highlights in his interview in the book is also the kind of international players, right, like BlackRock, that make these things more visible to us. If these processes of investment in housing started in the 90s, right, if to put a timeline to it, they became more visible after the crisis because of the involvement of these international players, big investment funds like pension funds suddenly picking up housing portfolios. There's a scale to it which becomes much more impactful on the overall city, I think, than earlier stages.
And so for these investors in real estate, there's an advantage to this urban crisis. There's an advantage to a limitation to supply because it facilitates this escalation in value, which then enables or produces policy which densifies the suburbs, which they also own. So it's a kind of, I mean, that all sounds a little bit joined up. Is that kind of what's is it policy and finance working in cooperation to generate this thing, or is it sort of neoliberal laissez-faire stuff, like just shit happening, basically?
Yeah. I think like yeah, I don't think we're, let's say, I don't think we're kind of introducing something particularly new. In this sense, much of our work is very much built on existing, let's say, research on financialization in the built environment, and particularly in the domain of urban studies and economic geography. There's a lot of research being done from this position. So in our book, we mentioned, we have an interview with Manuel Albers, I think also the work of Raquel Rolnick or Leonard Ma. They all have really dived into this issue. Going back to this financial crisis moment, I think this is really the first moment where you have significant amounts of private equity and, let's say, like corporate landlords entering the housing market, which is really radical, I think. So post financial crisis, or at least the story would go, is you have a lot of foreclosed assets, and then these would be bought up en masse by someone like BlackRock and then rented out again. And you have this, let's say, ability for these firms to mobilize capital reserves that normal homeowners do not have access to, and able to capitalize on this crisis in this way to pick up kind of cheap housing and then use this asset to generate more income. I think what's unique for our book is that rather than focusing on the inner city, right, which is usually the subject of, let's say, analysis in terms of high housing prices and affordability issues, is we're looking at its impact also on the outer city. And this is where we see, let's say, less so a kind of dramatic increase in prices, but at least in many of the examples we looked at, a kind of shift in housing tenure. So I think that I'm sure this story is familiar, where you have someone, they can no longer, the rent is getting expensive in the inner city. And then so they decide to move to suburbs, but instead of renting again in the suburbs, they want to buy, right? And then suddenly, they start thinking, oh, maybe I should buy a kind of small flat in the suburbs rather than renting. And I think that for us, this, let's say, shift in the imagination of how we think about housing tenure and how we understand housing policy has had dramatic impact, not just in this political, let's say, economic domain, but also in a kind of very physical way, I'd say.
Okay. Helen, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's also important to mention is, or to emphasize, is the role of the policy landscape here. And obviously that's going to be quite different between the different spaces in which we're working. But it's also really important to note, I think, particularly in the Swedish case, that we're really seeing now the effects of 20 years of quite concentrated lobbying from the property owners association here, which has led to some really significant changes in the ownership and regulatory landscape surrounding housing. So whilst the global financial crisis was important, in the Swedish example, 2011, for instance, is an important moment of change where the Property Owners Association took the Swedish state to court in an EU setting based on competition law, and managed to push through without actually a judgment, because the changes were made in advance in kind of fear of what would happen in the court case. In that situation, they managed to push through changes that saw our municipal housing companies be forced to operate on profit justification for all of their actions. So that fundamentally changed what a municipal housing company can do in terms of developing new housing, in terms of how they manage their existing stocks. We've also seen several decades of right-to-buy schemes to individuals, but also entire suburbs being sold as packages to large multinational corporations like Blackstone here, which was then sold to Hembla, which then became Vonovia, in the really quite commented on case of the suburb of Husby here in Stockholm. We've seen renovictions on the scale of entire neighbourhoods where concept renovation, which is where you kind of put in a nice marble bench top but don't fix the lift, concept renovations have driven existing quite precarious communities out of their existing housing arrangements. I mean, I think all of this has been at least in the Swedish context, a case of regulatory loopholes being opened and then being exploited. So it's not just about these predatory companies finding space, but also lobbying from the inside in to open those spaces in the first place. So I'd like to add that to that picture as well.
Amazing. Doesn't sound very good. Tahl, you've got something?
Well, just to go back to your original suggestion about laissez-faire being involved here, I think for us, the four cities are there to show how something similar is happening, but also to look at the differences, right? So from the four cities, London is, of course, the one that's most driven by laissez-faire, by investments, perhaps more than anyone else. And maybe Amsterdam, I wouldn't say least so, but it has such a strong planning department. The city council is so strong and in control that you know, it's a different case completely. It's actually one where some of the decisions leading to the eradication of suburbia are really top down, where, you know, the city decided or doesn't want to expand spatially, right? It doesn't want to build new suburbs at the city edge. Instead, it's directing all of the new housing to the suburbs, right? The suburbs will be the place of the housing, will be tenure change, density changes. And from the perspective of the city council, if people want to live in, little bungalows or something with their car, they can go and live somewhere else, right? That's basically what the planners say. So you know, there are distinct differences between how the process plays out, the role of the city council, the role of private investment companies or developers in each of the four cities.
So, I mean, one of the things I like about this discussion is this politicization, because the reason I make slightly asinine comments is I'm slightly asinine. But the other side is that I think from the perspective of an architect, or someone who's nearly an architect, just so I don't get sued by the ARB for saying I'm an architect, where you're kind of taught a story about architectural production, which is it's organic. It's like bees making a hive. You know, there's this kind of idea of the processes as almost being native to the species. And I find that what you're talking about is slightly startling, insofar as architects become this instrument of kind of other processes as well. And you call this, I mean, obviously there's this process of gentrification, which is referred to everywhere, and no one seems to know or describe what it actually involves, other than someone getting a better deal on a house than you have. So I'm kind of like, I am very, very interested in the way that this political process is being described, and the subservience in a way of architecture to this process. Like architecture has almost no role to play, like it's not even important. But then there's this other thing where you're talking about, which is there seems to be a shifting typology. We're talking about densification. That therefore means houses being knocked down and new typologies being built, which are taller, or the rooms are smaller, or I don't know, the gardens are smaller, or there's no drive, or there's no defensible space, or some. So there isn't also an architectural language that goes along with this. And I was wondering if there was, if you could talk about that a little. Like, what does densification look like? Does it look like one thing? Because we're dealing with companies like BlackRock, which are global, are they imposing, to a certain degree, a singular solution which absolutely ensures the return on their investment?
Can I answer this? Well, I think Helen and Leonard have quite a lot to say, so I'll just be concise about this and say that I don't think that BlackRock or anyone like that is actually shaping the response to their needs, right? What we do have, and that's actually interesting because it brings us into the realm of cultural response and choices and so on. This is where things dovetail together, right? The density satisfies investment. The density satisfies issues of sustainability and all kinds of policy choices which the city council is interested in, right? Public transport better and so on. So these things dovetail together. And then in the case, for example, of London, it's pretty visible how you have certain architects, architecture firms and developers who were previously active in the inner city, then or now or more recently building things in the outer city, right? And they bring their know-how and knowledge and how to do things and what they consider as right and good from the inner city to the outer city, right? So you see that kind of lacking the question of do we have to fit in? No, but because nobody likes suburbia, right? We're not supposed to be suburban. We have to do higher density anyway. So you see the solutions and architecture and designs and layouts and tenures from the inner city showing up in the outer city. In the case of Amsterdam, I was also fascinated by the way the urban renewal projects in the outer city resemble those of the inner city, despite so many differences, but including the use of the cultural component, which was so important in urban renewal in the inner city. Suddenly you see artist colonies popping up in the outer city. So we've got that cultural component aspect. And I don't know, I think Helen and Leonard should have something to add to this question.
Yeah,
Oh, perfect. You both started speaking at the same time. Helen.
Good. Sure. So a couple of years back, Secretary did a study on new housing being built in the Stockholm region, and it was really, I think, we looked at these new housing projects through the lens of typology. So we were kind of astounded to see perhaps the traditional modernist typologies that we had learned how to draw in school, like architecture school, kind of morphing and hybridizing in front of us. And it was only through really collecting the plans for 14,000 apartments, which was like 330-ish buildings, that we start to see these shifts, like the classic modernist tower block slowly kind of becoming something else, becoming chubbier, becoming more bumpy on its exterior, getting a little fat, having this sort of stomach that hangs out sometimes, tapering up to kind of wedding cake proportions in order to meet overshadowing issues or the preference for balconies. We also saw infill, and we haven't really talked much about infill, but the urbanization of suburbia is very dependent on infill. The infill of sites that previously were not considered suitable for housing, for instance, along train lines that get these kind of odd, slim proportions, these very, very long lamellar buildings, but in 10 stories with several tower blocks attached to them, trying to pretend desperately that they're not large. We saw an architecture that was trying to hide what it had sort of overeaten in terms of capital and volume. An architecture that was trying to pretend that it was multiple buildings, even though it was one continuous structure underneath. underneath. This kind of projection of an idea of urbanity that's vibrantly diverse, but that diversity only plays out on the facade as bands of color or shifts in materiality, what my profession disgracefully has pushed as articulation for the last 20 years, ever since, I guess, Jan Gehl just persuaded us that Copenhagen's inner city was the model we should follow. And so as a practice that also works with designing housing, we were careful not to necessarily critique what our colleagues had been pushed to draw, but also to try to enjoy it to some extent, that there was an aesthetic play here that was interesting, even if this was a byproduct and an attempt to negotiate within a set of really, really difficult regulatory conditions, and also, I guess, an attempt to negotiate with the clients and with the municipality, you know, trying to do a good job. We tried to also kind of enjoy what maybe had been accidentally produced, these tiny little castles rising from low density, I guess, urban landscapes. We tried to understand what the potential might be in those new forms that are springing up, and also acknowledging the issue with these fat, chubby volumes that have very, very poor sunlight access to interiors, that have double glazing. I mean, we always have double glazing in Sweden because it's so cold here, but that have like double glazed facades in order to deal with, for instance, the noise from train lines. I think that there's a possibility for an architecture to emerge out of that could actually be quite exciting. It's not something we looked at in the book, but I did want to just answer your question quite directly, that maybe we're not conscious of it yet, but if we started to play with it and work with it more, there might be some really exciting residential design opportunities within this odd space that's evolving.
Fantastic.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to add to Helen's like wonderfully vivid account, I think really the book tries to set out a kind of groundwork in raising this type of awareness that, you know, these transformations aren't happening in a vacuum, right? It's not just suddenly like architects, oh, you think of, you know, new models of living together or something like this. But in a very real sense, I think we're working in this tradition of architectural discourse that tries to explore architecture and architects' relationship with capitalism. And so, you know, like, BlackRock, Blackstone keep coming up, and Blackstone as the alternative asset manager du jour. They're simply chasing returns, right? They're just chasing capital where they're chasing a return on capital where it's possible. But I think the consequence that we're really trying to, let's say, track back to, and I think this is maybe particularly vivid for myself, although Helen's probably been in Europe longer than me, but as a kind of non-European, you really see this as a result of certain transformations to the welfare state under what we would call this neoliberal term. And in the book, we mentioned there's a lot of scholarly work that has been done on this, but let's say it reflects a moment where there's a concerted effort to reduce welfare provision wherever possible, right? So you cut welfare benefits wherever possible. And how do you replace this and not, you know, commit political suicide, is that you promote a kind of asset-based welfare. So the first iteration of this was very much Thatcher and right to buy, right? But now increasingly, we're now seeing where housing equity and building equity in your home is now seen as a way of creating a safety net for your household. So you can somehow directly, let's say, draw a link between homeownership, asset appreciation, and the reduction in welfare. And so the speculative bubble is really something, I think, that is driven not just by, let's say, you know, the presence of actors like Blackstone or other corporate landlords, but really a moment where we have a concerted effort to increase home ownership, whether it be home buyers incentives, let's say the lack of capital gains tax, financial products to let you release home equity from your home, that drive this kind of multi-layered, let's say, overlapping layers of forces that put pressure on the outer city to densify and to be, let's say, to replicate the models of the inner city. And this is why I think the comparative aspect of our book was very important, because every city has its own, let's say if there's this giant pool of global capital that either goes in the form of corporate landlords or into mortgages, the way they land in every city is slightly different. And the way they land slightly differently is really a result of policy. And policy is really something that politicians like debate and fight over. And that this is, I think, let's say, really highlights the agency that lies in those choices. And I think as architects, we have, let's say, we can play a role in this. And I think, I know I'm talking for a long time. If someone wants to jump in, it's good. But I think, like, as architects, we're really kind of fed a kind of diet of the good intentions of urbanization, whether it be Jane Jacobs, Jan Gehl, or Richard Ford in the creative class, or even someone like Rem Koolhaas, right, talking about metropolitan life, that we're promised a kind of imaginary that density and liveliness is ostensibly progressive, that you would have vibrancy, creativity, economic growth. But can this promise, I think what we really want to highlight is, like, can this promise really hold when we're spending more and more of our working hours paying for housing, right? When we're exhausted and anxious and precarious and saddled with greater and greater debt. And then we almost have to we take on another kind of role where we have to, become landlords ourselves, almost like that kind of your first instinct is like, oh, I need to pay my mortgage, so I'm going to rent my room out. Or my rent is getting really high in the inner city. I can't afford to buy in the inner city. So I'm going to be really into these kind of mini apartments in the suburbs because they're cheap enough for me to buy and to let out. And and there's enough kind of housing benefit out there that the subsidy will be enough to cover someone to afford that rent. So I think, like, I don't really have a conclusion in this manner. Maybe someone can take that from here.
Well,
yes. I had to think a little bit when Leonard was talking just there about Jenny Holzer and her work, Protect Me From What I Want, right? If you know the big billboard she had, where was it, in Times Square in the 80s, late 80s?
mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of the things we've been brought up to think are good are implicated here, right? And I think it's interesting to think through. I mean, again, in the case of London, you can almost see the different type of housing for different financial purposes, right? Because you were asking before, how does, Vanguard or BlackRock shape the architecture? So not quite, but I think, if you think of London and you think of the kind of housing which is built for investors, but maybe individual investors, right? They tend to be more the gated community type, right? Very luxurious gated community. And then you see the kind of developments like Greenwich Peninsula, let's say, or London City Island. They're much more urban. They have a very different look. But when you see where these projects were launched and how they were first sold, you can see they were sold to international investors of scale, right? More the pension funds and companies that invest for the pension funds and so on. And then you go to somewhere like Woolwich and you see housing which is actually being sold probably to the people who are going to live there. So again, a different category. But when you look at the prices are for, well, I would say top 10% of earners in the UK. Probably too many of them would struggle for the prices, and that is Woolwich. So you see these different categories. So that is a way in which you do see the financial aspect, not just the cost per square meter or anything like that, but the actual decisions regarding form and morphology being shaped to a degree through the financial. But again, this is not a precise book, right? It's the developers knowing who is going to buy it, who is it for, who is it aimed for. Of course, with these big projects for international investment, right? Like I mentioned Greenwich Peninsula and London City Island, you always need those kind of flagships, right? You bring in a big designer, or you have the kind of opera or something to give it that kind of gravitas, to give it a kind of a special branding that helps sell abroad to these big firms. Yeah. So again, you do see the fingerprints of these different investors' bias there.
In one sense, I mean, again, you mentioned how this process of densification of the suburbs is generating a new boundary to the city that differentiates. So rather than the suburbs being seen as this kind of hinterland between the urban and the rural, this kind of halfway house. There's a muddle between the two things. And it's kind of genius because it kind of works when it's done well. We're getting this kind of new urban form, and perhaps this is something Helen can talk to, which means that there's urban and then there's everything else. And the everything else is, as I can't remember if it was you or if you don't like it, go and live somewhere else, So I wonder, like, what does this look like? Where are we seeing this kind of urban rural boundary most clearly revealed?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is hard because we're dealing with such different geographies as well. I think that obviously these mechanics that we're interested in play out on regional scales, where, for instance, the edge of Stockholm starts to encompass the regional centres around it. Along kind of spanning along the train lines. I talked about these infill projects being very attracted to infrastructures, kind of sticking to them magnetically. So we have all kinds of, I guess, the concentric model of urban development starts to give way and be interlaced with linear form, with polycentric form. I don't think that we see a kind of a new city wall growing at all, but rather when you sit on a train heading out of central Stockholm towards the outer municipalities, you might look down at your book and then look up and suddenly see 10 to 12 story, quite large apartment buildings that are dispersed with potentially, let's say, a courthouse, a large factory building, and a big tech kind of cluster. And you might wonder, where am I? Where is this? And so we've been really interested in trying to kind of pull apart, okay, what is this that we're seeing through the train window is one question, but also what would it be to live in these areas, these pockets of high density development in the outer city. I'm quite interested in the question of who lives in these tiny apartments quite far from our central subway system on the commuter rail lines. We could say that these are new working class areas. These are new centres for community, for service workers, for key workers who move into completely new environments that are almost, they still smell like paint. There's still kind of blocks going up, a perimeter block after perimeter block after perimeter block around them. We're seeing really strange phenomenon in these areas that are not the city wall, but the edge. For instance, through the sale of rental apartments on block to hotel businesses that then rent out flats, for 24 hours, 48 hours, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a year, where, there's huge problems with criminality, prostitution. We also have at the same time tech workers moving into these. We also have families who've been displaced because of these renoviction processes also moving into these areas. Everybody in 35 square meter studio apartments kind of crammed together, booking by credit card, per night, their accommodation. This is like an odd kind of almost cyberpunk scenario that I think we haven't really processed within research. So it's very exciting space to be in, but also pretty concerning from a political perspective.
Now, can I add, the issue of the emergence of a city-country divide. We discussed that quite a lot in those months, because I think there's also, of course, differences in the process we see. I think we agree that this is a direction of travel. Whether it will be arrived at or not depend on so many things. When I look at London outer city is so massive and huge. I mean, how long will that take? The kind of densification of the outer city to reach the kind of point where the suburban belt vanishes completely or almost vanishes completely. This is a massive, massive project, which, has to go on for many decades to reach that point. I mean, that's a feeling, at least as it is now. It's helpful in that case, I think, for me, was to look at Amsterdam. Again, it's top down, so it's easier to see than some of the processes really led by laissez-faire. But, the condition in Amsterdam where there is no urban expansion at all, right? The decision is not to expand, not to add. And all of the housing needs are going to be satisfied by the outer city, right? The vision plan says it in Amsterdam. And the vision plan will probably happen as opposed to the London plan, which usually doesn't really happen, right? Because planners have all of that power. So the process is one in which high density is built up to the city edge and nothing beyond the city edge. In a way, you have a return to the pre-suburban moment, of course, right? This idea of the city as a community, the political community, comes from the traditional feudal city, right? A city which is a walled city, where there is a kind of clear barrier of inside and outside the community, and suburbanization eroded that, right? This idea that it's no longer town and country, but this in-between zone, which when it became sprawl, of course, sprawl is already covering everything, right, without a city. So this idea that there is a shift towards a return to something that formally resembles a city-country divide is the direction of travel. But again, whether we will reach it with any of the cities we're looking at or any other city, it's a question of how long will this trajectory continue? How much will this process continue? Will it reach its logical conclusion, or will it change? Which, of course, none of us know, right?
No. But it comes, that idea of the diffusion of the urban logic, like expressed in that the blue banana model. You know, this idea that there's this kind of peri-urban zone that stretches from sort of Manchester down through through France into northern Italy, of higher economic value, higher GDP cities, produces in it a peculiar, like, even if cities become very distinctly urban relative to the countryside, the actual lifestyles possible in the countryside are absolutely the same as the ones in the cities, bar being able to hear your neighbors have a shower. I mean, aren't they? I mean, everybody uses Amazon, whether they're in the middle of northern Finland or whether they're in central London. Everybody wears Nike trainers. Everybody's listening to bloody Taylor Swift. Everybody's life is exactly the same. So it's a false binary, isn't it? Really, this differentiation between the urban and the rural, and in a way the suburb. This is what I said in my email to you. I've often thought that the suburbs actually became the dominant. It's not urbanization of suburbia. It's that the inner city became suburbanized. They even listen to the music of the suburbs. People like the Rolling Stones were just like suburban, like, it's just like suburban music. And now we're rolling that back out in another process of kind of cycling back. I don't know, rant over. Anyway, I was wondering, given the fact that, as Helen, you say, this does seem like rather crisis-ridden, where are these points of resistance to it? Are there points of resistance? What does resistance look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Sweden has a really strong tradition of citizen-led resistance on the issue of housing. The models that we're now going to need to defend as we move into the second year of a right-wing coalition government are the models that came out of grassroots citizen movements in the early 20th century. The Swedish rental system, which is rent negotiated, which means that it's somewhat rent controlled, is always under threat from rent hikes. Every year it's renegotiated with the Property Owners Association and the Rental Tenant Union. Every year we have this argument, and it's constantly been under threat, at least for the last 20 years, of various kind of forms of deregulation. So we have, I would say, and I'm speaking to you today from one of the southern suburbs, Hagsätra, where the municipal housing stock was bought by Ikano, which is a branch of IKEA, not to be too too stereotypical here, but they bought the entire suburb, more or less. And I would say even in my local area, there is so much embodied knowledge about resistance, about how we would, if we needed to, stage a rent strike, about how we and where we would meet and what we would need to kind of organize. We have quite established renters unions or tenant unions here that have been quite active, but to the point, they've also not been so supportive of the more activist groups. So beyond the kind of formalized system of the tenant unions, we then also have the activist groups who are working particularly in the more socially vulnerable neighborhoods with spreading knowledge about how, for instance, and these are boring, mundane actions, how to, for instance, let your landlord know that your taps aren't working or that there's mold, how to lodge complaints that can go all the way to the tenants board, how to get your rent back if you've paid it but not been living in sort of hygienic conditions. These minor kind of victories all add up, I think, and it's really about knowledge transfer, about an organized civil society, and also about these channels whereby we can learn from each other. That's why it was such a pleasure to work on this book as an editor and get to read, for instance, the interviews that Leonard and Ma did with the housing activists in Berlin who've been advocating for the remunicipalization of housing there, and being able to read those stories and understand how that experience and knowledge might in fact, or has a direct kind of counterpart in the activists working in Husby, which was the area I mentioned earlier that was bought by Blackstone. So I think that these moments of exchange and learning from each other will be the key in trying to react to what's going on around us. And I feel quite optimistic. I think that we can do this. It's been done many times. We still have around 42% of people living in rental housing in the Stockholm region. That's not a small percentage. Should we choose to take to the streets, which may well be necessary. So defending the existing housing stock is possible. What I am worried about is how we defend something that hasn't been built yet. That is how we exert pressure over new development. And that's something we really dive into in the book. And that comes back again to the conversation around architecture, around policy, and where those pressure points might be found.
Yeah. Leonard, your mic is off. Do you want to say something?
Oh, it's on. I mean, I think we had a really funny moment like towards the end of working on the book where we just kind of laughed and we're like, oh, are we writing a defense of the suburbs? And I think the point is not to say that, this is good or this is bad, but really there's a kind of process that's underway beneath the surface, so to speak. And I think better if we want to talk about how we might resist or get to where we want to go is to reconsider this shifting of terrain, that we consider this drive towards urbanization in light of specific economic shifts and the role of the built environment and specifically housing within the new financialized economy. And I think in the Berlin chapter, we discussed this, as Helen had mentioned. I think that there was this campaign called Deutsche Wohnen Co-Enteignen, which is expropriate Deutsche Wohnen. And Deutsche Wohnen was the largest corporate landlord in Berlin. They've since now merged with another entity, Vonovia, and to create an even bigger corporate landlord. But there was something very radically strategic about their model of activism, because I think up to that point, whenever I met tenant activists, they were very much focused on the kind of experience of the tenants to let's say fight for those kinds of very specifically situated demands. But this campaign instead was a campaign to expropriate corporate landlords with over 3,000 units in ownership. And it was a very well-researched campaign. There was a legal basis for this. In the Berlin Constitution, since reunification, there was a specific clause that allows for expropriation of private property for the public good, in which case housing could be one of these goods. But what's so remarkable about this campaign is that it's not by showing this political desire to expropriate housing. They passed a referendum with 69% support in the previous election, which is more than any party in Berlin was able to achieve. So in a way, the party to expropriate corporate landlords is the biggest political party in Berlin. But what's so remarkable about this victory is that it's a very profound signal. It's a signal that housing is not an investment. And this is something that's something so simple, but actually so profound, because of the kind of knock-on effects that it would have. Of course, like, I mean, this story is kind of limited because Berlin has a very unique situation in that they have a very high percentage of renters, and even more than Stockholm. So I think it's something like 68, 69%. But still, I think under the surface, especially in Berlin, which is so well known for having this kind of creative, artistic culture, that there is a very real culture of renting. And I think that this kind of culture is also something that needs to be fought for and needs to be, let's say, defended as a kind of terrain of struggle. Yeah.
Beautiful. Tahl.
I would say, I mean, Helen just now talked really about the issue that, housing and how we have to defend housing, how in a way you're fighting the hyper-gentrification. Leonard pointed out what's been going on in Berlin, but also raised the question about what is our attitude towards the process we are describing, the one in which suburbia is being replaced with a kind of inner city in the outer city, right? And how we question what is our own position toward this process, right? And it's pretty complex because I think many of us were raised on dislike for suburbs for reasons we don't have to go into, right? We know very well everything which is wrong about suburbs, whether we go down the Jane Jacobs or Rem Koolhaas or anyone else route, as Leonard mentioned. So we come from also a place where we would typically work with students in the inner city, areas which are richer, where you have multiple programs going on simultaneously, different communities juxtaposed. A kind of very rich environment of the inner city has been our focus. But it's interesting to look how much our own focus parallels the focus of those who decide on policy and the financial focus of the market, right? It's as though our own interests as architects and also citizens, we somehow channel these, right? The problem of the inner city from the kind of crisis of Western inner city in the 1970s, the attempts to regenerate the inner city in the 1980s and 90s, and the return to the city, back to the city movement, which a lot of us are at fault for, also the return to the city for city living, where we actually think we're doing it out of our own choice, but there's also an economic issue involved here and directing where we place our own money, our own lifestyle. All of these things are part of bigger processes, including our interests as architects. So, beyond the kind of interest of Dennis Scott Brown and Venturi in Levittown, where you look at the quaintness of Levittown and say, oh, that's actually quite cute, right? What normal lower middle class people select as their styles and so on. There are qualities, we have to look, I won't say non-judgmentally, of course, judgmentally and critically at suburbs, but there is a lot to learn from them too, I mean, I've taken students not just to Thames Meads, but also to areas like the post-war garden cities of Amsterdam in the West, and there's some solutions to some of the problems we have today. When you look into how to deal with routes for traffic and for pedestrians, right? Car-oriented, we hear about suburbs, but we look at some of these, Thames Mead as well, fantastic options for movement for pedestrians, cyclists, all of these kind of things which the inner city struggles to do. And these are not just necessarily paradises for cars. They're actually quite well conceived and thought through. I found myself increasingly sending students to look at some of these plans for solutions for some things they've been developing. So, without question, there are qualities here. And I find it sometimes surprising, finding myself in Thames Mead when the urban regeneration they just began, and with a group of basically 21-year-old students looking around, and we all said, actually, this is pretty amazing, right? The wetlands, the quality of the green, and not just looking, of course, at the kind of brutalist development, which as architects we tend to love, but other aspects, we were like, actually, there are amazing qualities here. It's quite unique. It's quite different. You don't get this anywhere else. So when we, in a way, the idea that we have to look critically at what we tend to like, prefer, our preferences, and how the fact that they kind of dovetail so easily with the economic moment, right? With the dominant culture of the moment, with all of these things, whether it's a Sex and the City kind of heritage from 20 years ago of Manhattan living and so on. So again, I think looking a little bit critically at our own position is part of it. So it's not just looking at what's good for the city generally, but looking at how much our cultural preferences are shaped by economic moment, right? Something like that, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Ambrose. Lovely to meet you.
Your days of plenty are numbered, but with a bit of effort, they needn't be. Thanks to Leonard, Helen and Tahl for taking the time to tell me how. Thanks Jovis for the PDF too, links to it and everything else in the podcast description. Thanks for listening.